It's a treat for me to meet everyone. So good. Let's get underway. My name's Ed Dolnick. As you heard, I wrote a book called The Writing of the Gods, which is what the Egyptians called hieroglyphs. It's a book about the Rosetta Stone. What I was thinking I would do is talk just to set the scene for 10 or 15 minutes, something like that. And then I hope you'll have lots of questions. And depending on where those questions lead us, we'll venture one place or another. I'll let you take the lead on that. But let me first tell you a story. It'll take, as I say, 10 minutes or so. It's one of the great mystery stories of all time. In the history of the world, there's never been anything like ancient Egypt, nothing compared with it. Egypt was the mightiest empire the world had ever seen and the longest lived. Egypt reigned atop the world from about 3000 BC to about 0, which was the time of Caesar and Cleopatra. So that's a run of 30 centuries. And in nearly all that time, Egypt was the most powerful, the mightiest land on earth. So that's a run of 30 centuries. America is coming up on 3 centuries. So this is an astonishing thing. The time scale in which Egypt was so mighty is just about impossible to grasp. The pyramids are older than Stonehenge. They're from about 2600 BC. At the time the pyramids were built, Egypt had already been around, already been powerful for 500 years. Then come the pyramids, then come 26 more centuries before you get to the end. So from the pyramids to Cleopatra, that's from the beginning of Egypt's run to the end of it, is a longer span than from Cleopatra to the Wright brothers, say. And in all that span, Egypt ruled the world. Through all those centuries, visitors came to Egypt and they came away dazzled. This was a land like nothing they'd ever seen. There was already the pyramids and the sphinxes, that kind of thing. But in addition to that, on every temple, on every obelisk, on every statue, there was a mysterious kind of writing, or maybe it was decoration. Nobody was quite sure. It didn't look like our alphabet or like the Greek alphabet or like any alphabet anyone had ever seen. It was a kind of picture language, if it was writing at all. Snakes and owls and hunched little figures and zigzags. No one knew how to read it. So what you had in Egypt was this mighty empire, which went on and on, far superior to any foe. And Egypt itself, a bizarre country. It's a little strip of green along the Nile, down the middle of the country. And on both sides of the Nile, nothing but desert, thousands of miles of emptiness, of desert on both sides. In the north is the Mediterranean, and in the days that Egypt is reigning, no one had the technology to muster a navy to attack by sea. From the south, the Nile in the southern part of Egypt has quite fierce rapids, or used to, so no one could approach from the south. So you had Egypt protected by desert on east and west, protected by the sea and by rapids at north and south, alone, untouchable in the world. And on top of all this, Egypt was unfathomably, unimaginably rich. The ancient world ran entirely on agriculture. And in all the world, except in Egypt, agriculture was a fickle business. It depended on rainfall. And if the rains would come, you would have a good year. And if they'd hold off, it would be terrible. There'd be drought and famine and people dying. But in Egypt, where it never rained, nonetheless, by a miracle, the Egyptians saw themselves as blessed by the gods. The Nile overflowed, it dependably flooded each year, though there was no rain. So why it flooded was a happy mystery. And that flooding produced rich black soil, dependably year in and year out, perfect for crops, perfect for agriculture. This is an advantage that Egypt has alone in the world. Instead of good years and bad years, it's a perpetual series of good years. So the great mystery in Egypt was what all this mysterious writing was about. It was, the Egyptians made a giant deal of it. It's not only on every building and on statues in temples and so on, but on almost every surface of every building. And if you would have columns, there would be this hieroglyphs would be from top to bottom of the column. But if there were beams in the roof, on the writing, on the underside of those beams, there would be writing as well. On the tops where nobody could see, even where you would have to climb up if you wanted to see. There was something about this writing that was crucial to the Egyptians. But after the Egyptian Empire died, no one knew how to read it. That's where the Rosetta Stone came in. We'll talk about it in just a second, but let me talk for a minute about why writing was so important to the Egyptians, why they called hieroglyphs the writing of the gods, what that was all about. And what's important to grasp here is that writing is a human invention, and it's an invention that came late. It's about 5,000 years old, something like that. But humans have been more or less like us for vastly longer than that, for 50,000 years, for 100,000 years. No one is quite sure. The cave paintings, say, are 30,000 years old, a bit more than that, evidently painted by quite sophisticated people if you look at the artwork. And yet, none of those people, none of those cave paintings is signed. No one could have signed. The artist couldn't have signed their name. No one knew how that invention hadn't come along. It came along recently, as I say. A linguist did the calculation that if all human history was squeezed into a single year, so that the first cavemen and cavewomen in their caves are on day one, and us today are at the end of that same day, then writing would come in at about 11:30 at night of that single day. So there's no writing at all until then, which means that everything that our distant forebears in all those years did, all the wars and battles and love affairs and histories and stories they made up, all lost. We don't have any notion of it because no one could write it down. So that when some handful of geniuses did come up with this notion, a way of capturing the sounds of speech and capturing them in little squiggles on a page that would let you record the voices of people who weren't around anymore. This was an astonishing innovation. People were just dazzled by it, that they looked at it, and the Egyptians wrote about this. This was essentially the invention of memory. It wasn't that when a person died, any record of what they were like would die with them. Now you could write down what they were like. People could talk across the centuries, the Egyptians said, and they could speak across great distances. A person over here could send a message to someone on the other side of the country. And this was astonishing to them, that the world went from a couple of generations who could remember one another to as many generations as could preserve these marks on paper or on stone. So writing was this giant innovation, maybe the biggest of them all, because it's the one, as I say, that's associated with memory. It's the invention that keeps us from disappearing at the end of our story. But this writing in Egypt, presuming that that's what hieroglyphs was, knowledge of how to read it died out when the Egyptian Empire died out. So around the time of Christianity, the birth of Christianity. So then you have all these symbols all over Egypt, but no one knows what they are. So the cliche is that a mystery that no one can solve is a closed book. But Egypt was different. Egypt was an open book with writing on every page, but no one knew how to read that writing. Um, that's where the Rosetta Stone comes in. So Egypt, as I say, has this long run that ends at around the year 0. The Rosetta Stone is discovered in 1799. Nobody was looking for it. Somebody tripped over it, essentially. And what it is, it's a big stone about 4 feet tall, black, with writing on it. It looks a bit like a headstone in a cemetery. At the top of the stone are 14 lines of hieroglyphs, this mysterious picture writing with the snakes and the owls. And then there's a middle section of no one knew what to make of it. It's not pictures. It looks a bit more like writing, although in an alphabet that no one recognized. And then at the bottom was a third kind of writing, which was Greek. And people did know how to read Greek. And that was what made them so excited. That's what got your heart pounding, because here was a stone with 3 different messages on it, or 3 different kinds of writing. And the immediate presumption was that this had to be 3 different ways of saying the same thing, because why else would you bother to put it on a single stone? So now people are thrilled. They found this Rosetta Stone. This great mystery of the ages is going to be solved. They figured it would take about 2 weeks, maybe. It ended up taking 20 years. And so what my book is about is how that deciphering worked. What did they do? Why was it so hard? How did they figure it out? Let me tell you one little bit more, and then I hope there'll be questions. The story, I should say, like Caroline, I had gone to London as a tourist, like an awful lot of people do, and gone to the British Museum and seen the Rosetta Stone. This was 20 years ago or something, and I bought a postcard of it. It's been the most popular item in the gift shop since it arrived. There's Rosetta Stone book packs and neckties and handkerchiefs and shirts and mouse pads, but I contented myself with a postcard, which I tacked to my bulletin board, and it had been there for 20 years before it ever dawned on me that maybe there was a story I should learn something about. So at the heart of this story, when the Rosetta Stone is discovered, there are 2 great superpowers in the world, France and England. They're battling all over the world, and in fact, they're at war in Egypt. The person who finds the Rosetta Stone is a French soldier. The English end up defeating the French in these battles in Egypt, which is why, even though the French were the ones who had found the Rosetta Stone, it's why the Rosetta Stone is in England today, because the English said when they won, thank you very much, we'll take that. And they shipped it home and put it on display. But when the Rosetta Stone is newly discovered, and now back in England, the English do have the good manners to send out to make copies of the writing on the stone and send it out to scholars all over. But most people give up. They think they're going to do this. They'll be great. They'll have their name in lights. Turns out to be much too hard for them, and most people quit and move on to other things. It comes down to a race between 2 geniuses, one English, one French. The Englishman is named Thomas Young. The Frenchman is Jean-Francois Champollion. Utterly different characters. And for a long time in this race, they don't know of one another's existence. They're each working away, trying to crack this puzzle. Young is an all-around genius, a brilliant fellow, a physician, and then a physicist who had among physicists, his name is second only to people like Newton. He's just regarded with awe. He figured out the way light works, that it's waves as well as particles. A figure of daunting genius who didn't especially care about Egypt, but he cared about solving problems. When there was a great mystery, this was the greatest brain for hire in all of Europe. He would be turned to whatever task that was, and nearly always he would solve it. very quiet man, although combative in an understated way, but never one to raise his voice. Maybe a sly dig, but that would be about as much as close as he would get to argument. Champollion, on the other hand, is an over-the-top, exuberant, romantic character. Every day of his life is either the best day there's ever been or absolutely a suicidally depressing day. He's unlike Young, who's interested in everything. Champollion is interested in Egypt only. Nothing else can hold his attention, but he's obsessively focused on every question to do with English. They're, as I say, utterly opposite in temperament. They were both child prodigies. They both did have an immense gift for language. They start with Greek and Latin, and then they're on to half a dozen more by the time they're teenagers. So astonishing, daunting intellects in a race for this great prize of the ages, not knowing for a long time that there's anyone else on the case, day after day, staring at this stone, trying to make sense of it, and to their dismay, finding it a vastly harder problem than they had anticipated. So that's the setup. I can talk lots more, of course, but I hope someone will ask a question about something that you're curious about, and I would like to go in that kind of direction rather than guess where you might like to go. Does anyone have a question?
So I will ask a question. Who solved it and how, and what were the particulars? Was that jumping ahead too far?
When I was in 5th grade, we had to write book reports every week for English class. And I always ended mine in the same way. It said, if you want to know how this exciting book ends, you will have to read it for yourself. But let me tell you a bit about the setup, the contest. What goes on, and what started me on this quest, I happened to be in a Thai restaurant in Brooklyn one day, and the service was terribly slow, and so I had already read everything on the menu 3 times, and was looking for something to do. And I was looking at the Thai script, which is this lovely, curvy kind of script, and wondering how in the world, if someone gave me the challenge of reading it, how I would do it. And I was looking at, I was going to start with soup, and there was tom kha gai, which I always ordered, a kind of coconut soup, and there was another tom kha something. And so I decided that tom must mean soup because it had come up in both these words. So I was very proud of myself that I was well on my way in my deciphering career. And now I thought I would try to find where in the Thai it said tom, what I had taken to be soup. And I realized I didn't even know how to do that. I didn't know if you were to read the Thai, if you would start at the left and go to the right, or go right to left. I didn't know how words would be broken up. And it dawned on me at that point that this Rosetta Stone postcard had been on my bulletin board all these decades, that if I couldn't even solve my mini deciphering mystery, maybe it would be a good time to learn the story of the greatest deciphering mystery of them all. So it was at that point that I started to look into the Rosetta Stone story. And then I was thrilled to find that it had this element of a contest, of a race between 2 rivals who are each going at full speed, each unaware of the other.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
If I might. Why was the stone written in 3 different languages? Was it saying the same thing repeated at different time periods, or?
It said the same thing, but no, it was written at a particular time. It was written at, it turns out the Greek makes clear, it was written at a time that corresponded to, in our calendar, 196 BC. So very, very late in the Egyptian run. But when the scholars see it and see that it has Greek on it, they're thrilled because they can read Greek, and they set out to read it, and they're hoping and taking for granted that what the Greek is going to say is, here is a message written in 3 different scripts, and if you we're about to explain, if you'll keep reading the Greek, just what these hieroglyphs that everyone wants to know about, just how they work. But it doesn't say that. What the Greek says is, this is a stone tablet put up by the emperor Ptolemy, his name was, and then it goes on here, just line after line of chest thumping. I, Ptolemy, ordered that the stone be erected, and did I tell you all the mighty things I did? And I remembered to tell you about other mighty things I did. And by the way, there were still more of them, and no one compares with me, the mighty, the incomparable, the immortal. And it goes on like this for line after line. And the scholars who are reading it are now in a panic, because there's nothing about what the hieroglyphs are or any of that. It's just this chest thumping by the ruler. And as they get closer and closer to the end, they're getting more desperate now. We need something about the hieroglyphs, about comparing. And finally, at the very end of the Greek message, it says, and did I tell you how great I am? By the way, I am so great that everyone must know, no matter what language they speak, no matter where they are. And therefore, I'm writing this message of my achievements, my accomplishments in 3 different languages. And it should be in stones like this, with the details of my doings should be erected in every temple in the land. So presumably there were many Rosetta stones, although we've only found one. But there, only at the very end did it say, my message is so important that I've translated it into these different languages so that everyone will know of my accomplishments. So I should say that the Rosetta Stone is one of the famous documents in the world, if you can call a stone a document. But unlike the others, unlike the Declaration of Independence or unlike the Magna Carta, the importance of the Rosetta Stone isn't what it says, because the message is this mundane thing: bow down, ye peons, and hail my mightiness. The message isn't much. The point is how it's written, that it's will give us a way to gain access to the hieroglyphs. That's what's important, not the words themselves.
I have a question. I'm the video's not on me, but I'm Peg.
I beg.
The question is, was there enough information in Greek on the stone so that all hieroglyphs could then be understood?
No, there wasn't. In fact, what happened, the stone itself was broken, and it was broken at the top, which meant that a lot of the hieroglyph section, which is at the top, was missing. So that was a terribly bad break, because if you're going to solve this kind of a puzzle, or if you're going to break a code in wartime, say, what you need is a lot of message. The more, the better, because otherwise, you're having to guess, and you can't check those guesses very well. So what happens, the Greek, which is relatively short, did have enough on it to let you make a giant, crucial start. And it was Thomas Young, the Englishman, who was the first to see how you could get started. What he did, as he looked at the Greek, he decided that the most important word in the Greek message was Ptolemy, the name of the ruler of Egypt. That was the standout word, because the emperor, you would figure, is the most eye-catching figure of the day. So the name Ptolemy, he decides, which is in the Greek, must appear. There must be something in the hieroglyphs that corresponds to Ptolemy. But where do you look? The hieroglyphs are an unbroken string. There's nothing corresponding to space between words. You can't tell Are there 2 hieroglyphs to a word? Does it change? Are there 10? Maybe these aren't words at all. Maybe it's something else entirely. There's no spaces. There's no kind of punctuation that lets you know where to start, or even that gives a hint at right to left or left to right. But what Thomas Young does see in the hieroglyphs is that certain strings of hieroglyphs are enclosed in a kind of oval. There's about half a dozen of these ovals, and the hieroglyphs in them are the same string over and over again in each oval. Sometimes there's a few extra hieroglyphs at the end, but the hieroglyphs in this oval all start out the same. There's a bird and a snake and a zigzaggy ripple and something that looks kind of like a folded bit of cloth, something like that. The same hieroglyphs in the same order in each of these ovals. And so what Thomas Young's first guess is that the most conspicuous thing in the Greek, the most important feature of the Greek, is the name Ptolemy, the name of the ruler. And the most conspicuous feature in the hieroglyphs are these ovals with certain hieroglyphs repeated over and over in each oval. And what he decides, what he guesses, is that that oval is meant to call attention to something special in the same way that we would use boldface or italics. The oval means, look here, pay attention. And what could be more worth paying attention to than the name of the ruler, than Ptolemy? So Thomas Young's first guess is that this string of hieroglyphs in the oval corresponds to the name Ptolemy in Greek. And he sets out to match the first Greek letter in Ptolemy with the first symbol in this oval, and the next symbol in Ptolemy with the next symbol in the hieroglyphs. They don't quite match one for one, but they come pretty close. And it turns out that his guess was right, that indeed the oval that he guessed said Ptolemy really did. And so what Thomas Young had done, this is in 1814, about 2,000 years after the last person who read hieroglyphs had died, Thomas Young comes along to this dead language and is able to put his ear very close to the page and hear this Egyptian word spoken for the first time, as I say, in nearly 20 centuries. So it's only one word, but one word is a lot more than zero. And he's the first person who's ever got even that far in all this time.
Thank you.
Josh has a question too.
I did have another one. And
Yes.
that was, does Egypt have any interest in getting that Rosetta Stone back to Egypt?
They would love that. At the time it was taken, which was 1802, Egypt's glory days were thousands of years in the past. Egypt had no muscle to flaunt. England, which had the Rosetta Stone, was happy to snatch it away and to bring it back to England, and then to immediately proclaim that this important treasure of world culture was much safer in a home where it would be safe and appreciated than it would be in the land where it had been ignored all these years. In fact, when it turned up, the English and the French, as I say, were fighting in Egypt. The French rebuilt a fort from a crumbling old fort in a town that they called Rosetta. That's why the Rosetta Stone is Rosetta. And in the course of building this, rebuilding this fort, the French are knocking together a bunch of stones that have toppled over the years and trying to set them up into walls to make a new sturdy fort. And someone, and the name of this someone is lost to history, comes over to the soldier, the French soldier, the French officer in charge of building this fort, and says this: This next stone that we're about to shove into place in the wall, it's got these funny marks on it. Do you think they could be anything? And by good fortune, the officer who is told that in the middle of battle and commotion takes the time to look and says, "Wow, yeah, that's a big deal. Let's do something special with that. Let's pay attention." But for all these years, the Rosetta Stone had presumably not been in any place of honor. It had originally been set up by the pharaoh as a great thing, proclaiming his virtues. But then time had passed. It had evidently been recycled into other buildings as part of a wall, part of a tower, like using a Gutenberg Bible as the doorstop. It's completely no reverence at all paid to this astonishing element of world history. But as I say, the French find it, then the English take it. The English, once they have it, have no interest whatsoever in returning it to Egypt. And curiously, at the time, the Egyptians had not much interest themselves in the history of ancient Egypt. Egypt in 700 had been conquered by the Arabs. The Arabs now look at Egypt and its ancient culture as a benighted and particularly a pagan thing. Monotheism and Islam is the one true religion. What these Egyptians had been up to before with their idol worship was not something that a devout person ought to pay any heed to, and the particular monuments and the artifacts of that pagan culture weren't ones that modern day, this is 1800 modern day, Egyptians had any interest in at the time. Today, Egypt would love to have back its greatest treasure. As you know from other battles like this, the museums that have acquired, sometimes in shady ways, antiques are typically very reluctant to return them where they're from.
Ed, I have a question. This is Susie.
Mhm.
Obviously, Young and Champollion were really new to Greek, or they couldn't have undertaken the project. But neither of them, as I recall, I did read the book, could read Demotic either. So the Demotic was not really helpful in unraveling the hieroglyphs.
Yes, that's absolutely so. There were three kinds of writing on the Rosetta Stone, as we've said. The top was hieroglyphs, which nobody could read. The middle was this mysterious section, which as you say, is called Demotic, and the bottom was Greek. What the Demotic was, nobody knew. They thought maybe it was Syrian, maybe it was another language altogether. It turned out that what it was a kind of shorthand for hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are so gorgeous and so elaborate that to write them is too slow for ordinary purposes. So they were reserved mostly for writing on monuments, for official decrees, that kind of thing. And what the Egyptians used for everyday affairs was this writing called Demotic, which was a kind of pared down version of hieroglyphs. But nobody knew that at the time the Rosetta Stone was found. And what both Young and Champollion did was to guess wrong, was to say that this middle section, this Demotic, looks as if it's a language, looks more like an alphabet than the hieroglyphs do. So probably that's where we should start. And they both tried to match up those squiggles in the Demotic with the Greek, but they didn't get anywhere because the Demotic wasn't an alphabet. So their theory that we'll crack this alphabet was to go wrong from the get-go, and it led them astray. Demotic was something that you might be able to read at the end after you had learned about hieroglyphs, because if you start with a shorthand, you'll almost never get it. The only hope you will have for reading a shorthand is first to learn the official language, and then you can see what the shortened form is. But to start with the pared down version and to try to guess what that's all about was a task that nobody could solve.
Hi, this
I
is
have another, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Hi, I have a question. I think you said it was around 200 BC that the stone was created. Back in that day, was Greek a language that was common in Egypt?
Well, what happened, and the reason it was in Greek, was that Alexander the Great,
Right.
Greek, had conquered Egypt. So he, and then he had died not long after it, and one of his generals took over. That's who this Ptolemy was. That's why his name was Greek, in fact. And so what happens is that in Egypt, in these last centuries of its run, the ruling class is not Egyptian at all, but Greek. And the reason that they put Greek there is because in their minds, Greek is the language. And so a peculiarity of the Rosetta Stone is that the very pharaohs who put the Rosetta Stone in place themselves probably couldn't have read it, because they read and wrote Greek, they spoke Greek, they married one another, they had as little as they could have to do with the Egyptians they had conquered. They were a set apart within this country they had invaded and then conquered.
But the Egyptians traded all over the ancient world, and so that there were no other remnants of it elsewhere in the ancient world in Greek. I mean, in Greece, it was not carried. There's no other place where it was translated or even looked at or tried.
No, the knowledge of hieroglyphs died out fairly quickly. What happened was the writing. The ancient world was nearly all illiterate. The illiteracy rate is people's guesses range all over, but they're always on the order of 90% illiterate, 95%, 99%. There's not much writing going on. And the people who know it are a separate and highly regarded and well-off caste. To be a scribe in Egypt was a very powerful and well-regarded job. So no, there weren't many ways you could learn it. Only a very few did know it. That was precious knowledge, which was the basis of their living and their status. There wasn't much sharing of that valuable knowledge.
Did the hieroglyphs evolve so that what they read
Not yet.
in the Rosetta Stone, does that enable them to translate things that were written 1,000 years earlier?
Well, that's an awfully good question. On the one hand, Egypt had this long run, as I say, 30 centuries. And do you know, if you've ever tried to read Beowulf or something like that, English in a much shorter time has changed in a way that makes it terribly hard to read centuries old texts. That was true in Egypt as well. It was hard to read ancient things. But contrary to that, Egypt was an astonishingly conservative culture. It changed ever so slowly, and continuity and resistance to change was an important part of the culture. Things weren't meant to change. Change was bad. Change didn't mean innovation, which is what we take it to mean. It meant decay. So that the art from 2500 BC looks almost identical to the art from 500 BC. The same gods are worshipped, that kind of thing. change is vastly slower than you would guess. The Egyptians built the pyramids, say, which were they're 40 stories tall, the tallest buildings in the world for thousands of years. They built them without the wheel, even though they knew about the wheel. They didn't want to use it. So those millions, literally, of stone blocks that form the pyramids, each of them pushed in place by gangs of laborers. They didn't use animal muscle either. It's humans shoving these blocks into place day and night for, it would have been 20 years at the quickest to build a pyramid. So there was not only resistance to change, but positive hostility to any kind of innovation. So things did change more slowly than you would have guessed.
Do the hieroglyphics have an alphabet, or is it the pictorial representation of whole words?
Well, that's exactly the question that Thomas Young and Champollion are out to answer. And their first guess is, since the hieroglyphs are pictures, there's a snake, there's a vulture, they thought that it must be that these pictures have symbolic meanings, in the way that for us, a bald eagle, say, conveys not a particular sound or letter, but it stands for something. It means pride and independence and might, that kind of thing. And they thought that each of these pictures in hieroglyphs stood for some concept in a similar way as this American eagle. And in fact, that belief was so deeply entrenched that was one of the things that made it so terribly hard to decipher the hieroglyphs, because it was assumed from the days, the first visitors to Egypt, all the way to the year 1800, when Young and Champollion set to work, that hieroglyphs were not an ordinary alphabet. Everyone assumed that this was a kind of mystical language that had been invented to convey deep truths too abstruse, too arcane for ordinary language. So what the hieroglyphs said, everyone believed, were deep things about the nature of time and the universe and infinity, that kind of thing. Other alphabets were suitable for saying things like, don't forget to buy milk on the way home. Ordinary messages like that. But hieroglyphs, everyone thought, were a kind of priestly writing which conveyed these deep and sacred truths that the Egyptians had stumbled on. And Egypt itself, the whole culture, was held by all its descendants, except those in Egypt, ironically, in tremendous awe and esteem. And so people believed that the Egyptians had all sorts of mystical secrets that we have no access to, and they had written them down in hieroglyphs. And the reason the hieroglyphs were so mysterious was because these Egyptians were so much deeper and wiser than all their successors. Isaac Newton, who lived in 1700 and was probably the greatest scientist who's ever lived, he himself believed that all his discoveries, the theory of gravity and the notion of how the solar system works and where the sun is and where the planets are, Newton believed that the Egyptians had known all that thousands of years before him and before anyone else. And they had written it down, he thought, in these mysterious symbols. And then that knowledge had been lost. So what Newton and all the great thinkers of his age thought they were doing wasn't discovering new truths. They thought they were recovering lost wisdom from the Egyptians that the Egyptians had and then misplaced. In fact, the word discovery, it's from discover. It means taking away the cover. The notion of the scientists like Newton was that the Egyptians had figured things out, everything out, and then that knowledge had been covered up and lost. And what modern scientists thought they were doing was recovering, pulling back the veil and finding that lost knowledge. So this is a long way of saying, your question was, are the hieroglyphs pictures? The assumption was, yes, they are. But in truth, there are several things at once, and that's part of what made the deciphering so complicated. Some of them are pictures, and so a picture of the sun, say, might mean the sun up in the heavens. But in other contexts, that same picture of the sun might stand for the equivalent of the letter S, the first sound in the word. And how you knew when it was a picture of the sun and how you knew when it was the sound S was a terrible tangle. And that's what part of what hung up our geniuses, Young and Champollion, for so long. So the answer is the Egyptians did have an alphabet, so that a vulture, say, would stand for the sound V, roughly speaking. But it was more complicated than that, because, as I say, these drawings could have multiple interpretations.
I have a question.
Yes.
My name's Alan. Hello. There were hieroglyphs on all the buildings and temples and statues, and there were many of those, and they've been around for thousands of years. Why did it take the Rosetta Stone to create this much interest in translating the hieroglyphs?
Well, there was great desire to translate them all, but no one was able to make a start on the problem. And if you think about it, if you think of me and my Thai menu, except if I didn't have the English, or you if you don't speak Chinese and had found some Chinese manuscript, it would be terribly hard to get started if you had simply these mysterious symbols and no translation of this is a bill of sale or a love story or a coronation ceremony for the king thus and such. If you had nothing but these symbols that were strange to you, it would be terribly hard to know how to get started. And that was as far as people got for thousands and thousands of years. They would carefully copy these hieroglyphs and they would say they must be terribly important. And typically what they would do, as in that answer to a previous question, typically what people would do is look at the vulture and look at the sun and look at the snake, and they would attribute, they would say, I've translated this. And what they would do is give symbolic meaning that they had invented to these pictures. They said that there would be a picture of a snake, say, and they would say, this stands for danger and treachery, and the snake is next to a symbol that looks like water. And so plainly this message is saying, be careful that in the great depths of this river, danger lies. It turned out not to say anything at all like that. What it said was the snake was S and the river was R, and so those were just two letters in an alphabet. But people came up with these fanciful translations and then announced them with great pomp. I, the mightiest scholar of the age, have deduced the way to read these hieroglyphs, which no one has ever known. And here's what they say. They say, beware of the sacred river. And then someone else would come up with his own translation. There was no way of checking because there was no translation. Everyone's guess was as good as anyone else's. And that was where matters stood for century after century.
It took the Greek to get past that.
Yes, you needed to have some starting point, that some way of matching up. Here's a string of hieroglyphs, here's a string of Greek. Somehow or other, the hieroglyphs have to be saying this. They can't be saying anything fanciful that strikes me. It can't be simply that they're saying these mighty waters are treacherous or something like that.
So without the Greek, we still wouldn't know.
Probably not.
Mhm. Thank you.
I
Is
have
there
a
any-
question.
Yes.
Yes, is there any record who actually wrote these, who produced the hieroglyphics on the Rosetta Stone?
Yes, that is known. The profession of scribe was well regarded, and so there's lots written about who wrote. The Rosetta Stone itself isn't a signed thing, but we have lots of books and stories and things like this. Many of them with acknowledgement or recognition of who it was who wrote them down. If you could write, you were very pleased with yourself, and you would make note of that.
I have a question.
Yes.
I find it inconceivable that the Greek scholars in Alexandria did not have available to them a little dictionary translating from hieroglyphics to Greek. Well, what's your perception of?
What happened was that there were bits and pieces written down of what hieroglyphs meant. That it would say that the equivalent of an American eagle means not a bird but means bravery. So a hippopotamus means evil, say, or a vulture meant mother. There were little not quite dictionaries, but glossaries like that were written down. But it turned out that the only ones of those that have survived that we know about are a mishmash of a few things that are true and an awful lot that's not true. And it's not clear if the person who was writing down this kind of translation didn't understand what his sources were telling him, or if the sources for some reason wanted to keep this priestly knowledge to themselves, or if the manuscripts just got jumbled and badly copied or something through the years. But what you have is this mishmash of correct translations and then ludicrous ones, all presented with the same earnestness. And so that they're not, the few glossaries we have weren't nearly enough to do more than point you. They weren't enough to get you anywhere along the way.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Could you tell me what the Frenchman was doing?
What Champollion was doing. Yeah, so Thomas Young, the Englishman, is first off the mark. He's as I say, figured out this business or made a guess that certain hieroglyphs correspond to Ptolemy. And at this point, both Thomas Young and Champollion were from badly poor families. But Thomas Young, by good fortune, has a rich uncle, and the uncle dies when Thomas Young is in college and leaves him a fortune, and Young never has to worry about money again. Champollion is in a panic about where his next meal is coming from through his whole life. It's always a terrible problem. So while Young is puttering along, Champollion is trying desperately to find work in doing his translation in his deciphering in his spare moments. And Champollion, this is the Napoleonic era in Europe. It's a time of tremendous political frenzy. Champollion manages to be on the wrong side of every internal dispute. At one point, he's sent into internal exile in France. The job he did have, he's banished from. So life is very hard for Champollion. It's brilliant as he is, he doesn't have nearly the time he would like to spend on his deciphering work. But the next break in the story does come from Champollion. What happens is that two more of these ovals show up, these ovals that have, Thomas Young has guessed, that have rulers' names in them. And again, someone finds an obelisk that has Greek on it, on the base of the obelisk, and hieroglyphs on the obelisk itself. Now, this isn't like the Rosetta Stone, because the Greek and the hieroglyphs aren't a translation of one another. It says something in Greek on the base and something different in hieroglyphs, it turns out, on the obelisk. But the Greek does refer to two rulers. One of them is yet another Ptolemy. The Egyptians or the Greeks tended to reuse their names, and the other was Cleopatra. Again, it's not our Cleopatra, but it's a Cleopatra. So the Greek says in Greek, Ptolemy thus and such, and Cleopatra thus and such. And then the hieroglyphs on this newfound obelisk, there are two of them. There are two of those ovals, and one of them has inside it the same string of hieroglyphs that Thomas Young had already said read Ptolemy. And here's another Ptolemy in Greek, and here's another oval with that same bunch of hieroglyphs that already said Ptolemy. So that's seeming pretty promising. And so here's a second oval. We know that the Greek refers to a second ruler, Cleopatra. Here's the second oval. The first oval says Ptolemy. If the second one says Cleopatra, that would be a marvelous thing, because the names Ptolemy and Cleopatra have several letters in common. They both have a T, they both have an O, they both have an L. So if this guess was right, that certain string of hieroglyphs spelled out Ptolemy, then you could guess, well, if this is going to be Cleopatra, then the sounds from the Ptolemy should be in certain places in this new name. And so what Champollion did was figure out Ptolemy in the same way that Thomas Young had already done it. But then he had hold of this Cleopatra, he hoped, this new name, and he read the second name in an oval. So now he had two names in ovals, one Ptolemy and one Cleopatra. And because of the overlapping sounds, this was a kind of check. It was as if you had been doing a crossword puzzle, but you had so few clues that you couldn't check anything. All your answers were across. And now finally you had an up and down answer that crossed, and it made sense. It wasn't proof, but it worked. And so it seemed that now you had a bunch more. So if you were right that this new oval was Cleopatra, that told you the sounds of a bunch of new hieroglyphs. And so you could inch your way along like that. So that was the next thing that was the next break in the puzzle. Thomas Young figures out Ptolemy first, then several years later, Champollion comes along and figures out a second name, Cleopatra, which gives him a second handful of sounds, which lets him attack still more hieroglyphic writing.
Do you remember a TV show that showed Champollion doing some of this work? Did he not die of a heart attack somewhere along the line?
Champollion was plagued by health troubles his whole life. His temperament was, as I say, this up and down, always furious, ecstatic. If he had lived today, he would be the one who, if he got caught behind you in traffic, would be leaning on the horn and falling out the window and screaming at you and shaking his fist. Terribly excitable person with all kinds of heart trouble, and does die young. As I say, there was this great rivalry between the English and the French, each of them hoping that their genius would be the one to decipher it. And so the English made a lot of Champollion's temperament. To listen to the English, it wasn't that he had heart trouble, it was these flighty French, you know, and it stands to reason that at any minute he's going to do himself in with yet another temper tantrum. Champollion's family, after he died, did not have an autopsy, so no one is quite sure what it was that killed him. But it seems much more likely now that it was actually a medical problem than that he was too temperamental for this cruel world. Have we run out of questions? Have we come to the end?
Any more questions? Anyone? No? Well, this has been wonderful. Ed, did you have anything else that you wanted to discuss about the book?
No, I think we're good. The point, if you look at this, it's a yarn. It's not homework. It's a quite astonishing story, and I think you'll have new respect for the difficulty of this kind of deciphering and for the majesty of writing. I should say one thing, and then it'll be the last thing, and then I'll let you go for the night. Part of the fun, though, of this deciphering story and this magic of writing is that as impressive as Young and Champollion were in their deciphering, we can catch on to what they've done, because this deciphering is what each of us in our early reading days has done. You pick up a book and there are these squiggles that when you're too little don't speak to you at all. And at some point it dawns on you that the pictures and the marks below them have something to do with one another. And gradually you learn ever so painstakingly to sound out those marks. And then you can do it, and then you can read. And for Champollion and Young, it was on a vastly harder problem, exactly that excitement. They were doing the deciphering that each of us has done in our early school days, except they didn't have helpful teachers or parents to guide them along. And when they broke that code, they were just as thrilled and just as eager to march into a new world as each new reader is when it dawns on you that there's a whole library, a whole world of books and stories and information out there.
This has been wonderful. Thank you very much. Are there any final questions? Okay, if not, I want to say one thing in addition to thank you, Ed, and please, everybody, look at our website and join into our other programs. This is the season of where every nonprofit organization in the world is asking for help, and the library is doing the same. We need to raise almost a quarter of our operating budget through donations and the generosity of the community. And this is the period of our annual appeal, so that if you can, please support the library. If you live in North Salem, you'll be getting a letter. And if you don't, we still would hope you support the library. You can go onto our website and donate online if you choose to do so. So thank you, Ed. This has been absolutely marvelous. And thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Kathleen, for doing all the technical wizards, and Jen with the advertising, and Susie for helping me put this program together.
Well, thanks. It was a pleasure. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you so much.